on to the round of 12 we go, and have a night. Kyle Larson, we're back on the money stop. This is your most important NASCAR betting stop of the day. He's Cole Cusumano. I'm the little brother, Steven Cusumano, and I mean, Kyle Larson, Cole, he is absolutely the man to beat. He was your pick to win, not just the man to beat on a weekly basis, but I think you can argue he's the championship favorite right now. He set a new Hendrick Motorsports record for the most laps led in a win at Bristol, and it was all five and Kyle Larson from start to finish in that race on Saturday night.
Yeah, that was a hell of a performance. Honestly, there's not a whole lot to say on the race itself. I think that the bottom line is this short track package needs some significant improvements. Passing is extremely hard, as made evident once again by this race. Thought that things might be a little bit different because they brought the same tire they brought there in the spring. But if you'll reflect back to our last episode when we were previewing Bristol, I kind of had a feeling that things would not be the same way this time around just because temperature is a lot different. Things tend to be a lot more tame once the playoffs roll around. Everybody's minding their P's and Q's, and that's exactly what we got. Kyle Larson, 92% laps led in this race. Absolute all-time performance. And I got to pat ourselves on the back here because we absolutely knocked it out of the park. And with it not being a complete war of attrition and tire management, we nailed it. Quite simply nailed it. I was very high on Kyle Larson. I said going into this race that the first two races at Watkins Glen and Atlanta were major wild cards. This one was definitely more standardized, much more, what we come to expect on a weekly basis from drivers and just from a competition standpoint. And with that in mind, we got 6 of the top 10 drivers correctly highlighted in our last episode. 7 if you include my sleeper pick of Alex Bowman, who finished 9th. Going to rattle through these names really quickly for you. Kyle Larson, once again, the runaway winner. Chase Elliott finished runner-up. Bubba Wallace was a top 5 car the entire night. He was actually the only non-playoff driver in the top 10 the entire night as well, so big race for him. Denny Hamlin and Christopher Bell rounded out the top 5. Really strong day from that Joe Gibbs Racing duo. Then you had Ryan Blaney in 6th. Ryan Preece, one of our value picks, with a nice top 10 day, back-to-back top 10s at that. Another SHR Ford in 8th, and Chase Briscoe, another one of our value picks. Again, mentioned Alex Bowman in 9th. And Ross Chastain continues his red-hot run in the playoffs, albeit not in contention for the title, rounding out the top 10. So, again, thought it was a spectacular race on our parts, analysis-wise. Race itself was not that great, but gotta, just pat ourselves on the back and just give mad props to Kyle Larson for a hell of a performance at Bristol.
Yeah, he's good for one of these every once in a while. You just got to have a good old Kyle Larson beatdown every once in a while, and this was the week for it. But I think if there's some good news in terms of the competitive edge going all to Kyle Larson last week, well, this week we're going to probably the most competitive track on the circuit that is not a super speedway necessarily in Kansas. I mean, we saw the closest finish in NASCAR history, which, sure enough, it was won by Kyle Larson the last time we were here, but it was only by 1,000th of a second. So this is going to be really exciting. I feel like unanimously it's become the fan favorite track in NASCAR during this next-gen era, just because the restarts are incredible. The reigns for racing are just incredible. There's just so much competitiveness and excitement at Kansas, and it's not a complete wild card either. I think it's the perfect mix of all those great things that you like to see. But we want to preface by mentioning that the fact the starting lineup not going to be determined until Saturday at 1:45 Eastern time. So you're going to want to definitely keep that in mind before you lock in certain bets, or you might want to keep in mind locking in certain bets before qualifying in order to maximize your profit based on what the odds are here. And with that being said, here are the pre-qualifying odds. And as no surprise, Kyle Larson, heavy favorite, plus 275. Denny Hamlin's plus 550. Tyler Reddick plus 700. Christopher Bell plus 900. And then Chase Elliott plus 1,200. Those top 5 are 5 of the top drivers in terms of championship contention as well when you look at the standings. But I think, even in spite of the whooping that Kyle Larson put on last week, I feel like from what we've seen out of Kansas the last couple of years with this package, it's very hard for me to believe he is that heavy of a favorite at this track. I think he should be the favorite, maybe just not that heavy of a favorite. I think there's a lot of, just based on looking at that surface level, not knowing what the other odds are, that leads me to think that there's a lot of really good value later on in the pack.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I would definitely tend to agree that Kyle Larson should be one of the favorites, but to be that heavily favored seems like a bit of a trap bet to me, only because, obviously, we've seen the dominance time and time again from Kyle Larson at this track in Kansas in the next gen. But with that in mind, he still had quite a few races in the next gen era at Kansas where he's led a bunch of laps and he's fallen short, whether it be getting taken out by someone else's mess, whether it be a mistake of his own doing. It's not always a given. And I think with that in mind, I think that he is definitely by far and away arguably the favorite, but there are better values in that favorites tier. And I think that's where I'm going to start here with that in mind. The best values from this favorites tier. And I think the favorite, in my opinion, for this win is going to be Denny Hamlin, who is valued at plus 550 as the second shortest odds for the win. And once again, we're seeing GridRival value him almost mid-pack for DFS at $18.2 million. That's the 9th most overall, so an outstanding value for DFS. And Denny Hamlin finished 4th at Bristol, had a top 3 car the entire night. Is he back on track? I would tend to lean that direction, and I think if there's going to be a track or a race where he can definitely put the exclamation point down that he is going to get back on track and establish some sort of rhythm, it's going to be a place like Kansas where he has been the best of the best, arguably, in the next gen. Because when you look at his stats, he is the only driver to finish top 5 in all 5 next gen starts at the 1.5 mile track. He has 1 win, the second most laps led with over 160, and the best average at 2.8. So you're looking at a driver that averages his top 3 finish in 5 starts, so a really good sample size at a fairly unpredictable track. And on top of that 5-race top 5 streak in the next gen, that extends to a 6-race top 5 streak beyond that. And he's also a 4-time winner at this track in his career. So in my opinion, Denny Hamlin should not be counted out, just given Kyle Larson's dominance last week. I think, in my opinion, he should be the favorite for this race, even with Kyle Larson's performance last week in mind. Just seeing as how he's been able to execute on a yearly basis at this track in the next gen. Now, I think the best value in this category is going to come from somebody in the Hendrick stable, not named Kyle Larson, but his teammate and the runner-up finisher from last week in Chase Elliott, who is once again plus 1,200 for the race win. That is the 5th shortest odds for the win, and he is the 3rd most expensive driver in DFS at $19.6 million. So you're getting a good value for a race winner, but not so much from a DFS sense. And I say that because I think once you're going to highlight, obviously, Kyle Larson, I would imagine, here coming up next. Kyle Larson is the best Hendrick car from that stable at this track. But Chase Elliott, or for a race win, obviously, but Chase Elliott is going to be the best bet from a value sense for a race winner pick. Now, shifting gears to Kansas, Chase Elliott was a winner at Kansas in 2018. He also has a series best 10.2 average finish in 17 starts, so a really, really big sample size there. That should speak volumes that one of the youngest drivers in the Cup Series posts the best average in the sport at this point in time at this track, for one that's been fairly unpredictable at times. He also finished 3rd in the most recent race there, and that was his best next-gen finish at Kansas. He also finished top 10 with laps led in 3 of his 5 starts at that track. And I also want to point out that he has scored the top 5 most points earned in the round of 16 from the playoff drivers with a 9.7 average. There are some better drivers with an average finish that are not in the playoffs from that round of 16. So I think what I have here are 2 really good values. But, obviously I think Denny Hamlin's my favorite for the win, but Kyle Larson and another Joe Gibbs Racing driver are going to be really tough at top as well going into this one.
Well, I'll take it right from there, because if Chase Elliott is in the top 5 in odds, I'll go with Kyle Larson, of course, but I'll start with talking about Christopher Bell, because you want to talk about guys that had as good a run as anybody in the round of 16. you're not going to look any further than Christopher Bell. He is the most expensive driver on GridRival for a second straight week at $21.4 million, plus 900 for the win. And in the playoffs this year, top fives in 2 out of the 3 races, which was good for a 7.7 average finish, second most points earned of any playoff driver, and predating the playoffs. He's got top fives in 4 of his last 5 races for an average finish of 5.8, with his lowest over that time, 14th. And we go to a place in Kansas that's been very kind to Christopher Bell over his young career. He's got 3 poles here, laps led in all 5 next-gen starts at this track, 4 top 10s, a best finish of 3rd, which I kind of like because it feels like he's due to win at this track. And he has an 11.6 average finish here, which is really good. And that's even considering the fact it's kind of brought down. The average is brought down by a DNF. He did finish 6th here in the spring as well. So you're looking at the hottest playoff driver. You're looking for a guy that is due at Kansas, has great numbers here, and Vegas, rightfully so, has him as one of the favorites for this week. And we talked about the heavy favorite. That obviously is Kyle Larson. After he led 92% of the laps at Bristol, 462 out of 500. Let's see what his encore performance looks like, because last time at Kansas, I mentioned he won that race too by 1,000th of a second. So whether it's the most dominant win of his career or if it's the closest win of his career, a win is a win irregardless. He is a 2-time winner at this track. He's had over 700 laps led at Kansas, most laps led in 2 of his last 3 starts at this track, including 3 top 5s, including that win, and a runner-up finish. So he's been the guy to beat at Kansas in this next-gen era. Most laps led at Kansas with 276, the second best average finish of 3.4, a lowest finish of 8th in the next-gen at Kansas. And let's think about any time we go to a 1.5 mile intermediate type of track, Kyle Larson and that 5 team have it down to a science. They've got 8 wins in the next gen at these 1.5 mile tracks, including 2 this year, 1 at Kansas. He checks every single box you could think of. I think that, we were on the same page last week when we said that Kyle Larson, Denny Hamlin, in spite of the fact they got off to slow starts in the playoffs, we fully expected them to run in the top 3 and win last week's race in every respect. And I think that they're definitely going to be poised to, looking at how Kyle Larson and Denny Hamlin and Christopher Bell and Chase Elliott, our whole favorites category for that matter, had strong ends to the round of 16. I think you're going to ride that momentum, especially in the case of Kyle Larson with the win, and you're going to see those 4 drivers hands down the favorites this week at Kansas. I think it's going to be a race where there will be a lot of comers and goers. There will be a lot of players in this race, including some that are not in the playoffs. But your surest bets are, I would say, definitely those 4 drivers there in our favorites category.
Yeah, absolutely. And now looking at our sleepers category here, I want to mention one thing. So we just highlighted 2 JGR drivers, 2 HMS drivers. And as we get to the potential spoilers for the win and sleepers for the win, we're gonna hear again about 2 more Chevys and 2 more Toyotas. So there's going to be a lacking Ford presence on this episode, and that's not a knock on drivers like Ryan Blaney and Joey Logano, who I think have a great shot at being contenders for this win. We've seen these drivers excel, specifically in the fall race at Kansas, time and time again. But just speaking from a betting sense, I think what we go for are more sure things, or more what's likely to be a sure thing. And a lot of what we saw in that first round was unpredictable. I mentioned it earlier in the show. There was the Atlanta race, which was dominated by Team Penske. There was the Watkins Glen race, and then we had the one that was a stinker and more traditional at Bristol. And you saw guys like Chase Briscoe, Ryan Blaney, Joey Logano have really good rounds. But I think what we got at Bristol is going to be more of an indicator of what to expect in this second round. It's going to be a little bit more normalcy. I say that kind of loosely with Talladega in mind. But with Kansas, as we're analyzing Kansas, I think you're going to see some of these Ford drivers plateau off a little bit. I think you see drivers like from 2311 that have done really well at this track. You've seen a lot of the Hendrick guys do really well at this track. So that's not to say that guys like Joey Logano and Ryan Blaney won't have a good shot at the win. I just think that it's better to have the drivers we're about to mention here in mind as potential sleepers for the win, to put more money in your pocket. And with that in mind, I'm going to tackle the 2 bow ties in this category, beginning with Alex Bowman. And I mentioned this driver in back-to-back weeks as a sleeper for my picks. Was not highlighted in the specific category, but he's been much too good to ignore at this point in the postseason. He is plus 3,000 for the race win, and he is the 10th most expensive in DFS at $17.8 million. And he has statistically been one of the best drivers in the 2024 playoffs, with the most points earned overall with 120. The next best would be Christopher Bell at 103. So a 17-point margin gap, the next best playoff driver in that round of 16. He has a 10.7 average in that 3-race set with 2 top 10s and laps led in all 3 races. But yet he still enters this round of 12, 7 points below the cutoff, given his regular season stats. So I like Alex Bowman a lot, speaking on what we saw in the round of 16, as well as his Kansas stats in general in the next gen. He finished top 10 in all 4 of his next gen starts at this track. He did miss one for an injury last year, but he has the 3rd best average overall in the next gen at 7.5, with a 4th place finish in the fall of 2022, where he actually led the most laps in that race. So I think Alex Bowman has been a sleeper for, let's be honest, a majority of his career, but he has proven time and time again, once the postseason rolls around, that he is not to be slept on. He has made the round of 12 every single time he's made an appearance in the postseason, all 6 times now. He's made the round of 8 once in his career, and I think he could be positioned to do that once again, given the current stretch that he's on. So I like Alex Bowman quite a bit this weekend, and he is a really good value once again at plus 3,000 for the race win. And the next driver I'm going to highlight from the bow tie brigade is going to be a non-playoff driver who has been arguably the best driver in the playoffs, and that's going to be Ross Chastain, who is plus 2,500 for the race win and $19.1 million in DFS for the 6th most expensive. He may not be in the playoffs, but he ties Seabell as the driver with the 2nd most points scored with 103, with a 9th place average in that 3-race set, a best finish of 4th, and a pole as well in those 3 races in the round of 16. So he has been really, really fast. We know this team likes to play spoiler in the postseason. He won the finale last year. He obviously had that walk-off performance in Martinsville to make the championship for the year before that. So Ross Chastain, I know it wasn't the season he wanted, but he's turning it up when it counts. And I think when you look at his Kansas stats, there's reason to believe that he could continue this trend into this track, because he has the 4th best average in the next gen at Kansas at 10.2. The only downside is that his last 2 starts at this track, he finished outside the top 10. However, he led over 40 laps in his most recent start, and he has laps led in 3 of his 5 next-gen Kansas starts collectively. So I think factoring in the momentum and what we saw, these 2 drivers, Alex Bowman and Ross Chastain, are going to be strong contenders for this win, and I think they're going to be really good top 5 prop bets to look for in the big money bet section.
I completely agree. I think our winner very well could come from that pair of drivers or this tier of drivers overall. Speaking for a second on Alex Bowman, I mean, listen, what I said about Kyle Larson at the 1.5-mile tracks in the next gen, that extends beyond him. All of Hendrick Motorsports, they've had this locked down in the next gen era. From the 48, 24, the 9, the 5, they've been the top 4 drivers consistently at the intermediate tracks, including Kansas. And we've seen it before. The hottest version of Alex Bowman is one of the best drivers in the sport. We've seen it a lot early in the season. He'll go into a summer slump. We've never seen Alex Bowman hot at this time of year. This is when he's usually a little more cooled off. If he stays hot at the peak version of himself, playoff Alex Bowman's going to be scary. We've seen 3 races of it, and if he can get into victory lane and continue piling on that momentum from a strong start to the playoffs, it's a guy who could very well be an outlier or an outside shot at being in the round of 8 or the final 4 at the rate they're on. But that's obviously easier said than done. But I like that pick a lot, and I like another hot driver in Ross Chastain as a spoiler too. For a couple others, I'll start with a spoiler myself. I'll go with Bubba Wallace, who was the playoff spoiler last week, because, I mean, he's automatic at Bristol. All the short tracks, especially Bristol, Bubba is always great. He's plus 2,000 for the win this week. He is pretty steep in daily fantasy, $19.2 million, which is the 5th most expensive driver. But again, best non-playoff driver all night at Bristol. He finished 3rd. He ran top 10 all night, top 5 most of the night as well. And he won at this track in Kansas back in the fall of 2022. He's had top 10s in laps led in 3 of the 5 next-gen starts here, with an average finish of 12.8, which is very good for his standards over that same span. And his and 23.11 speed at the mile-and-a-half tracks has been really good in the next-gen era. I mean, you just I'm about to talk about his teammate, Tyler Reddick, but the two of them during this next-gen era have had, similarly to Hendrick Motorsports, have had really good speed at the mile-and-a-halfs consistently, and Bubba's got a win here. So does Tyler Reddick, the other guy I was mentioning from 23.11, that's had himself a strong playoffs, plus 900 for the win, top 5 in odds this week, entered the playoffs as one of the hottest drivers, and then had the up and down round of 16, and still had, obviously, the playoff points to overcome that start. A top 10 with 2 finishes of 20th or worse in the playoffs, so it's not the start he was looking for, but entering the playoffs, let's not forget how hot Tyler Reddick was. And he's been very hit or miss at Kansas, very boom or bust. He won this race a year ago. He's only had 1 additional top 10 in the next-gen era at Kansas. He finished 19th average, I should say, in the next-gen over that time, with laps led, though, in all 5 starts. So he's gonna run up front. Obviously, again, talking about the speed that 23.11's had at the mile-and-a-half tracks over these last couple of years, Reddick is a guy I expect to run up front. The volatility's been there at Kansas, but I think you're kind of picking up that risk with any driver this week. We've seen how crazy these races are at Kansas the last few times we've been there, but I love the 2 23.11 cars this week. Bubba Wallace, Tyler Reddick, definitely 2 guys I could see going out there and winning the race.
Yeah, and I know it might sound weird to have Reddick in this sleepers category, but I think my reasoning for putting him in this specific bracket is because obviously he didn't have as great a round of 16 as the other playoff drivers. Prior to that, he was one of the hottest drivers, if not the hottest driver in the sport, and I just want to see how he handles that adversity. Can he rebound? If there's going to be a track where he can do it, I think it's definitely Kansas. You mentioned the stats there, how he's very boom or bust. This is going to be a big moment for this team and this driver going into this round of 12 because obviously, he's not the best on the drafting tracks. We got Talladega coming up after this. He's been very good on the road courses, so he can definitely rebound at the Roval, but you want to see him at least get a good quality finish here to set himself up in case of a bad day in Talladega, and I think that we will see a very competitive race from this number 45 team. Now, as we get to our value picks here, this is going to be a very important section to listen up to because while I was compiling a few DFS lineups, this was a very difficult one to navigate, and you're going to have quite a bit of confidence in some of these drivers if you want to have a pretty competent lineup for this weekend at Kansas. So I'm going to kick things off here with 2 Spire Motorsports drivers because what we've seen from this organization over the last 3 weeks has been really, really impressive. This is a team with a pretty, bad stigma, I would say, since it's been in the Cup Series. But what we've seen specifically from Zane Smith and Carson Hocevar, the 2 drivers I'm about to highlight, has been exceptional. They're 2 of the youngest drivers in the sport, 2 rookies of the sport at that, and they've been borderline top 15 plays over the last handful of races. And I know Corey LaJoie is now shifting over to Rick Ware Racing for the remainder of the season, but even he has had some pretty flashy runs here in the last 3 races. But speaking on Zane Smith and Carson Hocevar, beginning with Zane Smith, he is valued at $16.1 million. That's the 15th most expensive in DFS, so a pretty steep price, honestly, when we're talking value picks, but I think that's for pretty good reason. He has had a lowest finish of 23rd over his last 8 starts with 2 top 10s and a 15.6 average. So when you're talking about a rookie driver for Spire Motorsports having a 15th place average essentially over 8 races, that is really impressive. And I just mentioned Spire's uptick in recent weeks. I have a lot of confidence in this driver and this team going into a race where, speed is key, and we've seen speed from this organization as of late. Now, on Carson Hocevar, he is just a bit more expensive in DFS than Zane Smith at $16.3 million, the 14th most expensive, so just one more position better than Zane Smith in that regard. And for pretty good reason. I think we've seen time and time again this entire year that Carson Hocevar has been a mainstay in this value picks category, and he's just gotten better as the season has gone on. And in that same 8-race sample size that I just mentioned with Zane Smith, he's had a 13.9 average finish. So basically a 14th place average over 8 starts. That includes 3 of his 5 top 10s this season, with his career best 3rd place finish at Watkins Glen 2 weeks ago. And he also has laps led and top 15s in 5 of those 8 starts. So he has been extremely impressive all season, but especially as of late. I am very high on the Spire Motorsports cars of Zane Smith and Carson Hocevar this week. And I know I didn't include him on this section, but Justin Haley's hopping in the 7 car this weekend and for the remainder of the season. Seeing what that team and that driver has done, or what that team and driver did in the Rick Ware equipment throughout the season, being one of the mainstays as well in this category. He's also going to be one to watch for sure this weekend, but I think just being that it's going to be his first race with this team, there's a little bit of uncertainty, but he's also that one that could be one worth watching at Kansas.
I mean, you're highlighting a couple guys that I think are the future of the sport. To see what Zane Smith and Carson Hocevar have done during the grind of this season, really the most difficult part of the year, the dog days of summer, entering the playoffs, like with the equipment they're in, it's been extremely impressive to see, and I expect big things from those 2 drivers in their careers. And listen, GridRival's caught on. Like you said, they're both top 15 in terms of the DFS values this week. I think another guy that was certainly in that conversation early this year, but not so much during that difficult part of the season, has been Noah Gragson, because we saw how hot he was to come out of the gates this year. It ends up being that this will be the final season for Stewart-Haas Racing. So for Noah Gragson, trying to finish on a high note. And he finished, remember how hot he was during the spring to start this year. He finished top 10 at Kansas. And, for the first time really since that spring surge we saw from Gragson, he's put together some solid results with back-to-back top 12 finishes, 11th and 12th the last 2 weeks. And, we saw what they did earlier this year. Gregson's got his ride next year. He'll go to Front Row Motorsports. But he's still racing for Stewart-Haas Racing right now, and I think that they want to finish on a high note. And in terms of value picks here, listen, he's not as expensive as the other guys. He's $11.9 million in daily fantasy. I think in picking Noah Gragson, he's a guy you can feel solid about rounding out your lineup with, because there's just not a lot of other great options. And you're looking at anything to grasp at. And you're looking at a couple of solid results in a row. The fact we've seen it done before. We've seen it done specifically at Kansas. And I think that Noah Gragson is definitely in that group of drivers that's trying to end the season on a high note going into his new team next year. Gragson will be the next driver's successor at Front Row Motorsports, and that is Michael McDowell. I think he's also a very solid value this week. 23rd in daily fantasy. That's $14 million. Also finished top 10 in the spring. Gregson's going to go into this car. Michael McDowell wants to end the season on a high note as well. 10th in the spring, 13.3 average finish in the round of 16, which is, you talk about playoff spoilers. It wasn't necessarily what somebody like Ross Chastain or Bubba Wallace did, but it was enough to get our attention for Michael McDowell. And over his last 2 starts, 7th and 11th. So Michael McDowell, another one that, you're looking for guys that you can feel pretty good about rounding out your lineup with. I like Zane Smith and Carson Hocevar as the kind of premium value pick options, but assuming you can only go with one of those guys, I think you can pick your poison between Gragson and McDowell. They're both really similar points in their seasons, very different points in their careers, but they're both just outside the top 20 in daily fantasy. So I think you can feel pretty solid about rounding out your lineup with those guys too. Let's get this down to 12 drivers, from 12 drivers to 6 though, Cole, because we mentioned 12. We want to narrow this down. So for the favorites category, I think there's some really solid options here. I'm going to take Christopher Bell from the value picks, or the sleepers, I should say. I'll take Tyler Reddick, if you can call him a sleeper. And then I'll take, for the value picks, I'll go with Noah Gragson.
Awesome. So I am going to go with Denny Hamlin for my favorite, Alex Bowman for my sleeper, and Carson Hocevar for my value pick.
And we'll get to, we mentioned that there are some really good values there up and down the field this week, but we're going to get to our daily fantasy lineup in a little bit. First, we want to talk about some big money bets. These are our favorite prop bets of the week. We call them big money bets because you can put some bigger money on them, and it's not going to be as big a payout, but you can feel pretty confident in doing something like a top 5 prop bet for someone like Chase Elliott at plus 150, which I'll start first. I like that one a lot. Chase Elliott at plus 150 to finish in the top 5 feels really good to me. I won't call this one a big money bet, but I do like Ross Chastain at plus 350 for a top 5 as well. I think that's a very solid value. And I think anytime you're looking at that even or plus 100-ish, double your money kind of range, Tyler Reddick at plus 100, Christopher Bell plus 120, those feel really good to me for top 5 prop bets. I don't think there's a ton of value to be had this week with top 10s this week, Cole, but a couple of our value picks that you mentioned, guys like Carson Hocevar, Zane Smith are certainly guys you maybe could make some money off there, but I think that this week there's some very solid value to be made with some top 5 prop bets.
Yeah, so I'm going to double down on what you said with Chase Elliott at plus 150. I think that's a really good one to definitely take into account. I think the Ross Chastain plus 350 is definitely worth looking at. Maybe not as confident as the Chase Elliott top 5 prop, but there is one top 10 that I'm very high on, and that's going to be Alex Bowman to finish top 10 at plus 110, so just above even. Big fan of that one. Definitely a big money bet. And I also wanted to mention a top 3 finisher prop bet, which we don't typically advocate for, but I think what we saw last week from Kyle Larson, I was confident enough that I would have recommended a top 3 prop bet. So I'm going to double down with that same notion for a Denny Hamlin top 3 prop bet at plus 150. And I'm going to use that as an insurance policy. So in my case, I feel really confident that Denny Hamlin's going to win this race. In the event that he is not, I am almost certain he's going to finish top 3, considering he has a 2.3 average finish, or I'm sorry, a 2.8 average finish in 5 starts in the next-gen era at Kansas. So I love that as a big money bet, as well as an insurance policy if you're going to bet Denny Hamlin for the race win. So my 2 big ones are going to be Bowman top 10 plus 110 and Denny Hamlin top 3 plus 150.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, this is a race where we mentioned before, this was decided by 1,000th of a second in the spring. I think we haven't mentioned this yet, you definitely want to have insurance bets. Like if you think that Denny Hamlin's going to win, lock him in for a win, but also make sure you got some money on a top 3, because if this is a 3-wide photo finish, which we saw earlier this year at Atlanta, you want to make sure that you're not going to lose your money. And I think that top 3 prop bets are very underrated this week. Regardless of which driver you think is going to win, I'm personally not locking in a winner pick without also locking in a top 3 kind of insurance bet this week. But with our friends at GridRival, Cole, there's a lot of other fun ways to bet, and we were just talking about, obviously, DFS prices. But before we get to that, I want to look at some better or worse bets. It's kind of like an over-under, but it's like, for instance, Denny Hamlin, better or worse to finish 5.5. I think we would both agree better, but Denny Hamlin's going to finish in the top 5. And you could parlay these together. So Denny Hamlin better than 5.5, absolute no-brainer to me. You look at some other ones like Kyle Larson better than 4.5. I think there's really good money to be made here. Another one of my favorites is Alex Bowman better than 12.5. I would say that if I had to pick 2 favorite better or worse picks on GridRival this week, it would definitely be those 2.
Yeah, I definitely have to echo those sentiments. So I actually highlighted 4 better, worse drivers here for this segment. I love the Denny Hamlin better than 5.5, so a top 5 for Denny Hamlin. I am a massive fan of Alex Bowman better than 12.5, so a top 12 for Alex Bowman. I like Chase Elliott better than 9.5, so a top 9 for Chase Elliott. And Bubba Wallace better than 10.5, so a top 10 for that 23 car. Big fan of all 4 of those, but even as good as it sounds on paper, it's tough to get 4 legs correct. So for, this episode's sake, I did a $10 proposal for a bet. If you do $10 full throttle, it's a $100 payout. If you use the safety car insurance feature and get all 4 of those legs correct, you get $50. If you miss 1 leg, you get $15. You're still coming out ahead $5. So I think I don't ever want to go or advocate to go above 4 legs in a parlay for any betting that you're doing. But I do feel very confident in those 4 drivers and those 4 positional better or worse finishes.
Completely agree. And that's an awesome payout for how confident I feel in those 4 better or worse picks. You could also parlay head-to-head matchups. And the thing I like about this, too, is that it's kind of like a spread. So Bubba Wallace to finish one and a half spots ahead of Kyle Busch. So he's got to finish 2 spots ahead of Kyle Busch. Or if it's plus, he would have to finish within 2 spots of him. So thinking about some head-to-head picks here, were there any that stuck out to you when you opened the app, Cole?
Yes, so I mention this every single week. GridRival has, like, an incredible amount of head-to-head parlayable matchups. However, I only found 2 this week that I was a big fan of. The first one, you mentioned it there. Bubba Wallace better than Kyle Busch by 1.5 positions. So Bubba Wallace has to finish 2 spots better than Kyle Busch. Seeing as how Kyle Busch has performed the entire season, this is a no-brainer to me, and especially when you take into account Bubba Wallace's pedigree at Kansas and that he's a winner at this track in the next gen. I'm a massive fan of that. And then I also like Alex Bowman over Chris Buescher at with a 2.5 positional buffer. So Alex Bowman could actually finish within 3 spots of Chris Buescher. And this might sound a little weird coming from the guy who lost the race in the spring by a thousandth of a second, and as the guy who played spoiler at Watkins Glen. However, I mentioned it when we were talking about sleepers. I think the Fords have kind of taken it, not really a step back from the Chevys and the Toyotas, but I think the Chevys and Toyotas have gotten better while the Fords have kind of plateaued out. And I think we saw that with Brad Keselowski in the round of 16. He had an awful showing in that 3-race set. I think you take out Watkins Glen, which was a bit of a wild card, and Chris Buescher was not the best in that round either. He didn't show up for Bristol. He didn't show up for Atlanta. So I'm a big fan of that one as well, seeing as how Alex Bowman has performed in that round of 16 and how he's performed at Kansas in the next gen. So I like those 2 a lot. You cannot do the safety car feature unless you have 3 legs for a parlay. So I did a $15 buy-in proposal. If you get both those legs correct, it's a $45 payout. And the cool thing I mentioned last week with GridRival, I didn't actually compile a combined parlay between the better or worse finishes and the head-to-head parlayable finishes, but you can have the luxury of parlaying a head-to-head matchup with a better or worse finish. So if you felt really good about Bubba Wallace over Kyle Busch by 1.5 positions and you wanted to parlay it with Bubba Wallace better than 10.5 and Alex Bowman better than 12.5, you can do that. So I don't have the exact numbers there if you wanted to do something like that because there are so many options we can do with the props we just mentioned. But you have that luxury of being able to do that with GridRival, which is, again, why I love this app so much and why I think it's such a blessing for motorsports bettors.
Absolutely. If I can throw one more on there, head-to-head, I like Chase Elliott over Ryan Blaney. There's no stipulations on positions. If I was to throw one more, a third leg in there, that would be it. But I like the 2 that you mentioned quite a bit too. And like you said, if you like one of those head-to-heads and you want to parlay it with a better or worse, you could get fancy and do Alex Bowman better than 12.5, and then you can parlay it with Bubba over Kyle Busch and do it however you like it. That's the best thing about this app. It is so customizable and catered to whatever you want. They do have traditional DFS as well, which this week you and I both agreed it was a little bit of a difficult week because a couple of our favorite values were kind of recognized by GridRival as a couple guys just inside the top 15-ish, top 20 in terms of DFS price, and that's Carson Hocefer and Zane Smith. So it wasn't the easiest week to build a lineup. You kind of need to have that dependable guy at the back end that you can rely on, whether it's a Michael McDowell or Noah Gragson, but you and I were both on the same page that we feel pretty good about a couple of the Hendrick cars. We feel really good about Denny Hamlin and some of those other sleepers we mentioned. So why don't you break down this DFS lineup that we collaborated on?
Yeah, so the first thing I did when I made my lineup was I went right to Denny Hamlin. We mentioned he was, the 9th most expensive, which is wild to think about given his stats at this track. So I went and plugged in Denny Hamlin at $8.2 million. Kyle Larson and Christopher Bell are much too expensive as the first and second most expensive in DFS this weekend. So I compensated for them with Chase Elliott at $19.6 million, our most expensive driver in our lineup. Mentioned our high praises of him in the round of 16 at Kansas in the next gen. Coming off a run-route finish, I think Chase Elliott's going to be a really good value if you cannot fit Kyle Larson in there. Again, Alex Bowman at $17.8 million is another really, really good value, just seeing as how he's performed in the round of 16 and how he's done at Kansas in his next-gen career. And yeah, you mentioned it there. I think why I wanted you guys to listen up to the value pick section was because you got to have a lot of faith and confidence in guys like Carson Hocevar at $16.3 million, Zane Smith at $16.1 million, and Noah Gragson at $11.9 million. Because I think they're as good as it gets when you're rounding out your lineup. And I really tried to get creative. I tried to mess around with different drivers, but for the sake of the drivers that we mentioned in this episode, this is as good as it gets. You could maybe fit in like a Michael McDowell somewhere, but I really felt better about those Spire cars, seeing as the run that they've been on as of late, and Noah Gragson given his top 10 finish here in the spring, and his back-to-back top 15s, 11th and 12th at that, over his last 2 starts. So obviously you could fit guys in there like Joey Logano or Ryan Blaney, but seeing as we had not highlighted them this show and how, I guess, pessimistic I am about the likelihood of them being more of a sure thing than the guys we mentioned on this episode, I think this is as good as it gets with Chase Elliott, Denny Hamlin, Alex Bowman, Carson Hocevar, Zane Smith, and Noah Gragson.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty simple from a construction standpoint of you're starting with Denny Hamlin and Alex Bowman without a doubt. And then the rest is kind of, pick your favorite ace and then round it out however you can. But I think we're on the same page that we like the Spire cars quite a bit this week. They've been really sporty, and I think very highly of those 2 drivers. So that's our DFS lineup. You got Chase, you got Denny, Bowman, Hocevar, Zane Smith, Noah Gragson. Lock it in, and there's a whole lot of things you can lock in. We've talked about head-to-head bets. We've talked about better or worse, straight-up winner picks. We've given you 12 names. We dwindled it down to 6 we feel really good about. It's time to put our money where our mouth is, though, Cole. We have picked a whole lot of race winners this year, including last week. You had the pleasure of picking first. You got Kyle Larson. I will say I also thought Kyle Larson was going to win. We're not going to pick the same winners. So, but bottom line is, we were on it last week. We've been on it throughout these NASCAR playoffs. And as we go to Kansas, I truly believe that this, like I said last week, that race at Bristol was going to be won by a former champion. I fully believe that. This week, I don't know. I don't think it's going to be won by a former champion. I think this is going to be a race that, I don't know if I should take that back. I don't think it's not going to be won by a champion, but I think it's going to be a little bit of a wild card. But I think that there's a lot of different possible outcomes we could see here. But I think the safest of those, you talked about Denny Hamlin. I like Christopher Bell this week. He's my gut pick. I feel like he's just been so good throughout a 5-race sample size, a 10-race sample size entering this one. He's been so good at Kansas. We've seen the speed from Joe Gibbs Racing. I feel like he's just coming into his own. I feel like we've seen Christopher Bell be a great playoff driver. We've seen the 20 team be a great playoff team years and years now. They've been in the championship for. I feel like this is the year where he's going to put it all together. And, we know Denny. We know that Larson are the 2 obvious favorites for the championship. I think that Christopher Bell is going to win maybe multiple playoff races. And I think it's going to start this week at Kansas.
That's a great pick, but I have to thank you for opening the door to allow me to pick Denny Hamlin, because that is a no-brainer pick in my opinion. I love Denny this weekend. I love his value at plus 550 for the race win. And by the way, I just want to say that something real quick on the race winner values. Again, we like to record these shows before practice and qualifying so you can maximize your payout before practice and qualifying. If you were to bet Kyle Larson before practice and qualifying last week, his value was plus 575 for the race win. By the time the race started and he started on the front row, he was plus 375. So you would have almost doubled your money if you bet him when you listened to our show. So I like Denny Hamlin a lot. He's my pick for the win for sure. And I got to go with Alex Bowman for a 3rd straight week. I hate picking the same drivers back-to-back, especially 3 weeks at that. But I would be foolish to not keep riding the Alex Bowman train into Kansas.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'll take Carson Hocevar for my sleeper. I think that Bowman is definitely the low-hanging fruit there. I think Carson Hocevar, again, we've seen it time and time again. It's a gut call, but it's also one where he's just been so good all year. He's defied the odds and the experts. But, man, Kansas, Really great track. Like I said, I think this is probably the industry favorite in the sport right now. It is the epitome of what NASCAR racing should look like at every track, and this is going to be awesome. It's the Hollywood Casino 400, 3:05 Eastern Time on Sunday. Any parting words?
No, just really pumped up for this race. I think you said that all that had to be said. It is by far and away, in my opinion, one of, if not the best tracks on the circuit. I would temper expectations because I don't know if we're going to see a photo finish again. I could be very wrong on that, but in a similar sense to Bristol, I just think we're going to see a little bit more of a reserved race with a lot on the line for these playoff drivers. But I think nonetheless it's going to be a really fun one, and I cannot wait for it all to go down on Sunday.
Yeah, well, we will drop the jack on this edition of the Money Stop. As any good Money Stop ends, we've been balling. We've been balling out, and hopefully you've been telling us, Mike, you said, we like to do these episodes a certain time of the week so that you can maximize the value on the odds makers ahead of qualifying, ahead of practice, before these cars hit the track. So hopefully you're listening early. Hopefully if you're listening late, hopefully you're able to get your bets in by the time the race starts, and hopefully you can tune in a little earlier next week. But that'll do it. We'll drop the jack. This has been the Money Stop presented by Kickin the Tires and GridRival. Great stuff, Cole. For Cole, I'm Steven. We'll see you guys next week when we enter race number 5 of the playoffs. Gotta make 'em wanna come back for more.